Hello and welcome to Autistic Changeling. Today I'm going to talk about meltdowns and shutdowns. So I'm going to call meltdowns and shutdowns together just overloads, and then I'll distinguish between the two when it becomes relevant. I like to think of them as sort of like a video game bar where you fill it up and then when it hits the top something happens. Meltdowns and shutdowns are, I think, some of the more obvious autistic traits, but they're also a trait that people don't seem to really know a great deal about. And I think they're also something that, for the people experiencing them, if you don't know you're autistic, it can be very confusing. I didn't have good words for meltdowns when I was younger, so I tried to figure out how to talk about them, but it's really hard if you don't have the word, because I'm sure some people thought they were anxiety attacks. I didn't think they were, but when everyone else is telling you something, it's pretty hard to be like, well, I don't know, when you don't actually know. So that's why I think it's important to talk about them. Basically, overloads are what happens when an autistic person receives too much stressful input. That can be sensory issues or sudden changes or alterations to routines, or just emotional stress, excessive social interaction, all of these things that build up slowly over time, and they'll fill up this fictional meltdown meter. And then when it hits the top, that last thing that fills it up is what seems to cause the overload reaction. And this can make it seem like the autistic person is having a reaction to something that's very minor, and that might not necessarily be what's really causing the reaction. It is possible for an autistic person to have an overload just because of one thing, and that one thing might be something that seems less important to a neurotypical person, but often a meltdown isn't just about the thing that actually triggered the meltdown. And I think that's important to realize. A meltdown or a shutdown itself is a reaction to that overload of emotion or sensory input or pain or anything like that. And it's basically your system's way of trying to protect you. It's a defensive mechanism. People don't get to choose whether or not to have an overload, because, if we could choose to just not have to deal with that, we probably would. And you also can't choose if you're going to have a shutdown or a meltdown or what it's going to look like. For the most part, you can't just say, well, I feel like having a shutdown today. It just doesn't work like that. How you react to an overload depends basically just on how your system works. Some people tend to have more meltdowns and shutdowns, and some people tend to have more shutdowns, and how long they last and how frequently they occur depends on the person. I tend to have meltdowns more than shutdowns, so I can't talk too much about shutdowns, but basically a shutdown is less physically reactive, I think. It's more of a freeze reaction. It can still be very painful, but there's less physical movement. The person might not be able to really process as much of what's happening outside. It's like your brain is trying to separate you from what's happening. They might be able to understand everything that's being said, but just not react to it. It probably, again, depends on the person who's having the shutdown. But in general, the distinction is that shutdowns are a lot less physical movement, a lot harder to necessarily notice as much. They're probably still noticeable, but it's less of an explosion, I guess. And meltdowns are more of a physical reaction, often characterized by crying or screaming or sometimes hitting or banging your head, or trying to run away, more physically obvious stimming, stuff like that. And those aren't traits every person has while having a meltdown. That was just a sampling of traits that people might have while having meltdowns. And in general, regardless of which type of reaction a person is having, or whether they're having some combination of the two, because, those might be the two ends of, what's possible, but people's reactions can be, varied and different. And it's not like you have to only have a stereotypical meltdown or a stereotypical shutdown. Overload reactions can be a lot more diverse than that. And, you know, maybe it'll get blended with a panic attack or something fun like that. And, you know, there's a lot of different ways it can happen. So, regardless of how an overload reaction occurs, they do tend to occur for similar reasons. And they tend to, in general, feel painful in a way that I don't think it's easy to explain. I've tried, when I'm talking to therapists, sometimes they'll ask me like to describe how a meltdown feels, and they don't seem to really get that it's not just anxiety or fear. Like, I have a hard time personally describing the predominant emotion in a meltdown. A lot of people talk about feeling angry during meltdowns. Personally, I don't really. It's just pain. It's not even necessarily an emotion for me. It's just pain. It's just an overload reaction, and it like whites out the scale, and you can't say, oh, this is clearly an emotion or this is clearly physical pain. It all just blurs together. And that's me. Other people might describe it differently. So in general, I think during a meltdown, things that help for me are, you know, getting away from the source of whatever caused the reaction, because, you know, there might be other factors building up to it, but, you know, that thing that actually triggered the final reaction is probably not helping. So being in an environment that's less overwhelming, you know, quieter, darker, sensory inputs like a weighted blanket helps me. High pressure can really help calm down a lot of autistic people. And of course, individual autistic people have different needs and preferences here. So just getting away from the source of overload definitely helps. If it's caused by some sort of a miscommunication or an emotional reaction to something, then it might actually help to talk about that and to work through it, but you have to also make sure the person is capable of doing that. Some people are actually capable of communicating throughout a meltdown, and some people are not. And for the most part, communication that happens during a meltdown might not be the best, might not be the clearest, probably won't be the most productive conversation you're ever going to have, but it can help to get through it sometimes, and sometimes it won't. It depends on the person. Things that definitely do not help when someone is having a shutdown or a meltdown. Yelling is not going to help. Yelling, angry reactions. If someone is having a meltdown, adding to that overload by being angry or showing that anger is just going to increase the level of overload and fill that bar up even higher, which will make it harder for it to cool down. Touching a person probably won't help. If someone has told you beforehand that it's okay, then it's okay. But if you haven't talked to the person and prearranged that, I would not recommend touching someone while they're having a meltdown. Getting in the way of the person's ability to leave, making them feel trapped, also not a good idea, and that's how you accidentally get hit if the person is just having that panicky need to escape. Being in the way of the escape is probably a bad idea. You know, stuff like that is not going to help. And, you know, basically you can help reduce the level of additional stress that's being added to the overload reaction, but time is the only thing that can really make it go away. And that level of cool down time differs for everyone. Some people get over meltdowns in a matter of minutes, and some people it takes hours, so it's pretty strongly dependent on the person. After a meltdown is over, there's usually, again, back to the video game references, it's like if you die in a video game and just after you respawn, there's this like brief period of time where the game prevents you from taking damage because it doesn't want to have to kill you like at the same time as you respawn. It's like that. You can't have a meltdown, like for me anyways, I can't have a meltdown right after another one. There is a little bit of a cool down period where it just won't let it happen. I don't have the energy. Meltdowns take a lot of energy. It's very physically and emotionally demanding. So I just don't have the energy right after a meltdown to have another one. But after that brief cool down is done, you might be more likely to have another meltdown because your resources are drained. So there can be this sort of a nasty meltdown cycle where you have a meltdown and you don't have adequate time to recover, so then you have another meltdown, and that's not fun. So meltdowns, I think, are something that is pretty stigmatized, of course. They're not fun for anybody involved, but I think there's this sort of an assumption that people who are having meltdowns are just having tantrums or trying to be a pain or trying to manipulate people into giving them what they want, or basically just the assumption that people are choosing to have this reaction and could just stop it if they wanted to, which is definitely not true. But I have had people try to tell me that, you know, it would be more convenient for me if I didn't have meltdowns, and I'm like, I know. I don't know what to tell you, I know. But, you know, there is a lot of stigma, and I do think it's important to remember that as much as meltdowns suck, they do serve an actual purpose. They don't just exist to piss us off. Meltdowns are a part of our system's regulation. They're how we regulate stress. It might not necessarily be a pleasant way to regulate stress, and I highly recommend trying to catch your level of stress and bring it down before you have a meltdown. But it's a reaction to things that happen. It's not a moral thing. It just happens. You know, people get sick sometimes. Sometimes people have, I don't know, allergies. It's just like that. There's no morality behind it. Having a meltdown doesn't make you a bad person any more than sneezing, if you breathe too much dust, makes you a bad person. So that's something that I really want to put out there, because I know there is a lot of guilt, I think, after having a meltdown, both because of, you know, maybe the feeling that you should have been able to control it, and because other people might not like that you had a meltdown, but it's nobody's fault. It just happens. I also feel like people tend to assume that autistic people are super violent because of meltdowns, and I don't think that's true either. A lot of the time, people who are having meltdowns and shutdowns don't actually want to hurt other people. There might be an instinct to self-harm, and that's not necessarily because of the desire to hurt yourself, for the record. Maybe for some people it is, but also it's sometimes just because the sensory overload or emotional overload is just so much that you need to release the energy somehow, and also because of the desire for deep pressure. Sometimes when someone is hitting themselves during a meltdown, they're actually trying to fulfill a sensory need for deep pressure, and a weighted blanket or something like that can actually really help reduce that feeling. Or sometimes it's because the person really needs to leave the area because there's too much sensory input, and they don't know how to express that, and they're frustrated because of that. Or sometimes it's because they need to leave and there's someone else in the way, and like I said, that's when someone can seem violent because they're panicking and they don't know how to get out. And I think following, you know, some of the advice that I gave earlier, or talking to autistic people to find, you know, more tips like this can really help reduce the amount of accidental damage that happens to the autistic person or to others when meltdowns are happening. Because, you know, as much as it can be frustrating to see someone having a meltdown, it's probably worse for the person who is having the meltdown. And last, I want to talk about avoiding meltdowns before they occur, because, you know, you can talk about how to reduce the damage that happens once the meltdown has started, but, you know, ideally you don't want to get to that point. Meltdowns suck, and they're hard, and if you can avoid them, that's probably for the best. So, you know, it's not always possible to avoid having a meltdown. They happen, and that's just how it is. But they can be reduced in frequency or intensity sometimes for some people. Not everybody will be able to avoid having meltdowns all the time, but reducing the level of ambient stress is pretty helpful. I know I have meltdowns much less frequently now that I'm done with college. College was pretty bad in terms of meltdown frequency, for me anyways, simply because of the amount of stress and people and, you know, sensory input. It was just a lot going on. And so for me, having more control over my sensory surroundings is very helpful. You know, being able to recognize when you're getting to that point where you need to take some time to wind down is very helpful. And that's something that takes practice, you know. You need to, you know, just keep trying. So things like, you know, noise canceling headphones or having stim toys can be very helpful there. And, you know, if you can take the time to engage with your special interests, and to just do things that aren't stressful after doing something that is stressful, you know, basic stress management techniques that apply to neurotypicals as well will probably also, in general, help reduce stress for autistic people for the most part, with some exceptions like sensory input requiring special care and that sort of thing. And if you can reduce the amount and frequency of meltdowns, you know, that's ideal. So I think I've talked long enough and I have a bit of a headache, so I'm going to finish for now. If you have comments, questions, or anything to add, especially if you tend to have more shutdowns and you want to talk about those, feel free to add a comment, and have a great day.